Most people try to change their lives by changing their circumstances. This is the default approach to improvement. If something feels wrong, the natural response is to look outward and identify what needs to be different. A better job, a better living situation, a better relationship, more money, more freedom, more recognition. The assumption is that if the right external changes are made, the internal experience will follow. Life will feel better because life will be better. And sometimes this works. Sometimes a change in circumstances does produce a genuine improvement in how life feels. A stressful job is replaced by a calmer one, and the daily experience shifts. A difficult living situation is resolved, and there is real relief. These are not imaginary improvements. They are tangible. They matter. External conditions absolutely influence how life is experienced. But something interesting often happens, even when circumstances do improve. The improvement is felt for a while, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, and then it fades. Not because the circumstances have worsened again. They may still be objectively better than before. But the way life is experienced begins to settle back toward a familiar baseline. The new job becomes routine. The new situation becomes normal. The initial relief gives way to a new set of concerns, frustrations, and dissatisfactions that feel remarkably similar to the ones that were left behind. This pattern repeats itself across many different kinds of change. People move to new cities and eventually feel the same restlessness they felt in the old one. People achieve financial goals and find that the security they expected does not arrive with the number. People enter new relationships and discover, after the initial excitement fades, that many of the same internal tensions have followed them into the new partnership. None of this means that external change is pointless. It simply means that external change alone is often incomplete. It addresses one layer of the experience, but leaves another layer untouched. And that untouched layer, the one that persists regardless of what is happening on the outside, is the layer of thinking. The way situations are interpreted, the way events are processed, the way the mind constructs its ongoing narrative about what life is and what it means. Why do some people remain calm and steady even when life is uncertain, while others feel overwhelmed even when things appear to be going well? Why can two people face the same situation, the same setback, the same challenge, and come away with entirely different emotional experiences? Why does the same event devastate one person and barely register for another? The difference often lies not in what is happening, but in how it is being interpreted. The event is the same. The interpretation is different. And it is the interpretation, not the event, that determines the emotional response. The interpretation shapes the feeling. The feeling shapes the behavior shapes the outcome, and the outcome reinforces the interpretation. This cycle runs constantly, beneath the surface of everyday experience, and it operates whether a person is aware of it or not. When thinking begins to change, even slightly, the experience of life begins to change with it. Not because the external world has shifted, but because the internal filter through which the world is perceived has become a little clearer, a little less distorted, a little more aligned with what is actually happening rather than with what the mind habitually assumes is happening. This is not about positive thinking in the simplistic sense. It is not about pretending that difficult situations are pleasant or that problems do not exist. It is about developing a relationship with one's own thinking that is more aware, more deliberate, and more honest. A relationship that recognizes when the mind is adding unnecessary weight to a situation, when it is projecting outcomes that have not happened, when it is interpreting events through a lens that amplifies difficulty and diminishes what is working. This kind of awareness does not appear overnight. It develops gradually, through attention and practice. But as it develops, it changes the daily experience of life in ways that are both subtle and significant. The same challenges feel more manageable. The same uncertainties feel less threatening. The same ordinary days feel more alive, not because anything has changed on the outside, but because the way the inside relates to the outside has shifted. And that shift, quiet as it may be, is where a different kind of improvement begins. The way thinking patterns shape daily experience is far more pervasive than most people realize. Most people believe they are responding to life as it is. They believe their emotional reactions are caused directly by events. Something happens, and they feel a certain way, and the feeling seems like the only natural response to the event. The connection between event and emotion feels automatic, inevitable, unquestionable. But between the event and the emotion, there is almost always an interpretation, a thought, a narrative, a conclusion about what the event means, and this interpretation happens so quickly, so habitually, that it is invisible. It appears to be part of the event itself, rather than something added by the mind. Consider what happens when someone receives critical feedback. The event is the feedback itself, a specific set of words delivered in a specific context. But the emotional response is not generated by the words alone. It is generated by what the mind does with those words. If the interpretation is that the feedback reflects a fundamental inadequacy, the emotional response will be shame or despair. If the interpretation is that the person delivering the feedback is unfair or uninformed, the response will be anger or defensiveness. If the interpretation is that the feedback contains useful information that could lead to improvement, the response will be something calmer, something more open, something more constructive. Same event, different interpretation, different emotional experience, different behavior, and eventually, different outcome. This pattern operates constantly, not just during significant events, but during the ordinary moments that make up the majority of daily life. A friend takes too long to respond to a message. The interpretation might be that the friend does not care, or it might be that the friend is busy, or it might be nothing at all, a neutral event that does not require interpretation. But the mind rarely leaves events uninterpreted. It fills in meaning automatically, based on habit, mood, past experience, and the underlying assumptions that have been running for years. When these automatic interpretations go unexamined, they shape life in ways the person may never recognize. The accumulation of small, habitual misinterpretations can create a general sense of being undervalued, mistreated, or unlucky that has more to do with the pattern of interpretation than with the pattern of events. And because the interpretation feels like reality, the person never thinks to question it. This is where the difference between reacting and responding becomes practically important. Reacting is automatic. It follows the interpretation without pause. Something happens, the mind interprets it, the emotion arises, and the behavior follows, all in a rapid sequence that feels like a single event rather than a chain of separate moments. The person does not choose the reaction, it happens to them. Responding is different. Responding involves a pause between the interpretation and the behavior, a moment in which the interpretation is noticed rather than simply followed, a moment in which the person recognizes that the thought about the event may not be the only possible thought, that the conclusion they have drawn is one reading of the situation, not the only reading. And in that recognition, a different response becomes possible, not guaranteed, but possible. This pause is small. It does not require a long deliberation or a complex analysis. It requires only the brief awareness that a thought has appeared, that the thought is shaping the feeling, and that the thought may not be entirely accurate. That awareness alone, held for even a few seconds, can change the trajectory of a response. It can prevent an angry reply that would have damaged a relationship. It can prevent a panicked decision that would have created more problems than it solved. It can prevent the kind of spiraling internal narrative that turns a minor event into a major source of stress. Learning to pause before forming conclusions is one of the simplest and most powerful shifts a person can make in how they engage with daily life. It does not require eliminating initial reactions. Those will still arise. It does not require always arriving at the perfect interpretation. That is not realistic. It simply requires creating a small space between the event and the response in which the mind's initial conclusion can be observed before it is accepted as truth. Over time, this pause becomes more natural. It does not require as much conscious effort. The habit of noticing the interpretation before acting on it becomes part of how the person processes experience, and the effect is cumulative. Each instance of pausing, of questioning, of considering an alternative interpretation adds to a growing capacity for clearer, more measured engagement with life. The reactions do not disappear, but they lose their automatic authority. They become one input among several rather than the sole dictator of behavior, and this leads naturally to another dimension of clearer thinking that has a significant impact on daily experience. The ability to view challenges from a broader perspective. Most people, when facing a difficulty, experience it from the inside. They are in the middle of it. It is immediate. It is pressing. It fills the entire field of attention. And because it fills the field, it feels enormous. It feels like the only thing that matters. It feels like it will never end. But most challenges, when viewed from a broader perspective, are smaller than they feel in the moment. They are temporary. They are survivable. They are part of a longer trajectory that includes many phases, many changes, and many events that have not yet occurred. The difficulty of the current moment is real, but it is not the entirety of the person's life. It is one moment among many, one challenge among many, and it will pass, as previous challenges have passed, and be replaced by something else. This does not mean minimizing difficulty. It does not mean telling someone who is struggling that their struggle is unimportant. It means developing the internal capacity to hold a difficulty in context, to recognize it as real, while also recognizing that it is not permanent, to feel the weight of it, without concluding that the weight will never lift, to experience the discomfort without assuming that the discomfort defines the entire future. This broader perspective does not appear automatically during difficult moments. It has to be cultivated, and it is cultivated through the repeated practice of stepping back from the immediate intensity of a situation and asking a few honest questions. Will this matter in a year? Is this as permanent as it feels right now? Have I faced something this difficult before and come through it? Is there anything about this situation that I am not seeing because the emotional intensity is narrowing my view? These questions are not magical. They do not make the difficulty disappear, but they introduce a crack in the wall of immediacy that the mind constructs around a challenging experience. And through that crack, a broader view becomes available, a view that includes the parts of life that are still functioning, the resources that are still available, the history that shows that previous difficulties were survived. This broader view does not eliminate the challenge, but it changes the experience of facing it. It makes it feel less overwhelming, less total, less defining, and this connects to something that plays an enormous role in the quality of daily life: emotional control and its influence on decision-making. Most people are aware, at least in theory, that emotions influence decisions. But the degree of that influence is often much greater than they realize, and the consequences of emotion-driven decisions often extend far beyond the moment in which the decision is made. When a person is angry, their decisions tend to be punitive, focused on retaliation or correction, narrow in scope and short in consideration. When a person is afraid, their decisions tend to be avoidant, focused on escape or protection, often overly cautious, shutting down options that might be valuable. When a person is excited, their decisions tend to be expansive but poorly considered, focused on possibility without adequate attention to risk or consequence. None of these emotional states is inherently wrong. They are natural. They arise in response to real conditions. But when they drive decisions without the moderating influence of calmer, clearer thought, the decisions tend to be suboptimal. They tend to serve the emotion of the moment rather than the well-being of the longer term. And the person is often left, once the emotion has passed, with a decision they would not have made under calmer conditions, but must now live with. Emotional control, in this context, does not mean emotional suppression. It does not mean shutting down feelings or pretending they do not exist. It means developing the ability to feel an emotion fully, while still retaining the capacity to think clearly, to experience anger without being blinded by it, to experience fear without being paralyzed by it, to experience excitement without being carried away by it. The emotion is present, it is felt. But it is not the only force at work. Alongside it, there is a quieter, steadier capacity for evaluation, for consideration, for weighing the likely consequences of different courses of action. This capacity develops over time. It is not a switch that can be flipped. It grows through the repeated experience of noticing emotions as they arise, acknowledging them, and then choosing what to do with them, rather than simply being directed by them. Each time this process is practiced, the capacity for it strengthens slightly. The emotional storms do not become less intense, necessarily, but the ability to think clearly in the middle of them improves, and that improvement has a direct, measurable impact on the quality of the decisions that shape life. There is another pattern of thinking that, when recognized, can significantly reduce the amount of unnecessary mental stress a person carries through a day, and it is one of the most common patterns in human thought: the tendency to create problems where none actually exist, not deliberately, not consciously, but through the habit of projecting negative outcomes onto uncertain situations. The mind does not like uncertainty. Uncertainty feels threatening. It feels unstable. And in the absence of clear information about how a situation will unfold, the mind tends to fill the gap with predictions. And those predictions tend to skew negative. Not because the mind is trying to cause suffering, but because the mind is trying to prepare for danger. It is scanning for threats. And when no specific threat is visible, it generates hypothetical ones, just in case. This results in a significant amount of mental energy being spent on things that have not happened and may never happen. Worrying about a conversation that has not yet occurred, anticipating a rejection that has not been expressed, preparing for a failure that has not materialized, running through worst-case scenarios that, in the vast majority of cases, do not come to pass. The mental stress generated by these projections is real. The body responds to imagined threats in much the same way it responds to actual ones. The tension is felt. The anxiety is experienced. The quality of the present moment is diminished by the weight of a future that exists only in the mind's construction. Clearer thinking does not eliminate uncertainty. It does not prevent the mind from generating predictions, but it creates a different relationship with those predictions. It allows the person to recognize them as projections rather than truths. To notice the thought, "I know this is going to go badly," and to hold it with some lightness, rather than treating it as a confirmed report from the future. This does not require dismissing all concerns. Some projections are reasonable and warrant preparation, but many are not. Many are the mind's default anxiety response to the unknown, repeated so often that they have become habitual, running in the background of daily life, and adding a persistent layer of stress that has no basis in current reality. Learning to distinguish between productive concern and unproductive worry is a practical skill that significantly reduces unnecessary mental burden. Productive concern leads to action. It identifies a real risk and prompts preparation. Unproductive worry loops without resolution. It revisits the same concern repeatedly without producing any actionable insight. It consumes attention without generating value, and when it is recognized as such, it can be set aside, not ignored, not suppressed, but noticed, acknowledged, and allowed to pass without being followed into the loop. Letting go of constant comparison with others is another shift in thinking that quietly but significantly improves the quality of daily experience. Comparison is one of the most automatic and pervasive habits of the human mind. It happens constantly, often without any conscious decision to engage in it. Someone else's achievement is noticed, and the mind immediately evaluates it relative to the person's own position. Someone else's lifestyle is observed, and the mind constructs a narrative about what that lifestyle implies about the observer's own adequacy. This habit creates a persistent sense of insufficiency, not because the person is actually insufficient, but because the comparison is always skewed. What is visible about another person's life is almost never the full picture. It is a fragment, a surface, a curated representation that omits the struggles, doubts, and dissatisfactions that are present in every life. And comparing one's complete, unedited internal experience to someone else's partial, edited external presentation will almost always produce a feeling of falling short. The person who begins to reduce the influence of comparison does not become oblivious to what others are doing. They still notice, they still observe, but they develop the ability to let those observations pass without turning them into evaluations of their own worth. They develop the capacity to see another person's success without interpreting it as evidence of their own failure. They learn to appreciate their own trajectory on its own terms, measured against their own starting point, their own circumstances, their own goals, rather than against the visible fragments of someone else's journey. This is a significant shift. It does not happen quickly or completely, but even a partial reduction in the habit of comparison produces a noticeable change in daily emotional experience. There is less ambient dissatisfaction, less of the vague feeling that something is missing, less of the restless sense that life should be different, better, more like someone else's, and in the space that opens up when comparison quiets down, there is room for something else, for appreciation, for presence, for the recognition that the current moment, with all its imperfections, is the actual substance of life and deserves attention on its own terms. There is another dimension of clearer thinking that has direct practical consequences, and it involves the distinction between what can be controlled and what cannot. Most people spend a significant amount of mental energy on things they cannot control. Other people's opinions, the outcome of events that have already been set in motion, the behavior of colleagues, family members, or strangers, the broader economic conditions, the timing of opportunities, the fairness of situations. None of these things is within the individual's direct control, and yet much of the worry, frustration, and anxiety that characterizes daily experience is generated by the attempt to control them. The attempt takes the form of mental rehearsal, of imagined confrontations, of repeated analysis of situations that cannot be changed, of frustration directed at conditions that are not responsive to frustration. This misdirection of energy is costly, not because caring about these things is wrong, but because the mental energy spent on trying to influence the uncontrollable is energy that is not available for influencing the controllable. And the controllable, the person's own behavior, their own responses, their own decisions, their own daily habits, is where genuine influence actually resides. When a person begins to redirect attention toward what they can actually affect, the experience of daily life changes in a practical way. The sense of helplessness that comes from wrestling with things beyond control is replaced by a sense of agency that comes from focusing on things within control. The actions may be small, the influence may be limited, but it is real, and the feeling of engaging with something real, something responsive, something that actually changes in response to effort, is qualitatively different from the feeling of endlessly cycling over things that will not change, no matter how much mental energy is devoted to them. This does not mean becoming passive about larger conditions or indifferent to things that matter. It means recognizing, honestly and clearly, which elements of a situation can be influenced and which cannot, and allocating attention accordingly. The result is not a loss of concern, but a gain of effectiveness. The same amount of care is present, but it is directed more efficiently, and the reduction in wasted mental energy produces a clarity and calm that many people have not experienced in years. Developing patience during uncertain situations is another expression of this clearer relationship with control. Uncertainty is a constant feature of life. Very few outcomes are guaranteed. Very few paths are clearly defined from beginning to end, and the natural response to uncertainty is anxiety. The desire to know what will happen, the urge to resolve the ambiguity as quickly as possible, even if the resolution is premature or poorly considered. But not all uncertainty requires resolution. Some of it simply requires patience. The situation is unfolding. Information is still arriving. The outcome has not yet been determined, and the most effective response, in many cases, is not to force a resolution but to wait, to allow the situation to develop further, to gather more information, to let clarity emerge on its own timeline rather than manufacturing a premature version of it. This kind of patience is not passive, it is not resignation. It is an active choice to remain engaged with the situation without forcing it into a shape that serves the need for certainty rather than the need for a good outcome. And it requires a kind of mental discipline that is closely related to the other capacities being explored here. The ability to sit with discomfort, the ability to tolerate the anxiety of not knowing, the ability to trust that clarity will emerge if the process is given enough time. Most poor decisions during uncertain periods are not the result of insufficient information. They are the result of insufficient patience. The person had enough to make a good decision if they had waited, but the discomfort of not knowing pushed them toward action before the situation was ready. And the premature action, driven by the need for resolution rather than by the availability of sufficient information, produced an outcome that was worse than what patience would have yielded. And this connects to something that many people struggle to accept, which is the idea that discomfort is a natural part of life, not an aberration, not a sign that something is wrong, not an indicator that circumstances need to be changed immediately, but a normal, expected aspect of being alive, a feature, not a bug. This does not mean that all discomfort should be accepted without question. Some discomfort is a signal that something genuinely needs to change. A harmful situation should not be tolerated simply because discomfort is natural. But much of the discomfort that characterizes daily life is not this kind. It is the discomfort of uncertainty, of waiting, of not having all the answers, of facing a challenge whose outcome is unknown, of feeling the tension that comes from caring about something without being able to guarantee how it will turn out. This kind of discomfort does not require a solution. It requires tolerance, the ability to feel it without being overwhelmed by it, to carry it through the day without letting it dictate behavior, to recognize it as part of the landscape of a fully lived life rather than as an emergency that demands immediate intervention. When this tolerance develops, the overall experience of life becomes more stable, not because the discomfort disappears, but because the relationship with it changes. It no longer triggers the frantic search for a fix. It no longer generates the cascade of worry and planning that so often follows the initial sensation. It is simply felt, acknowledged, and allowed to exist alongside everything else that is happening. This is where observing thoughts instead of immediately believing them becomes not just a useful skill, but a transformative one. The mind generates thoughts constantly. Some of them are useful. Many of them are not. Some are accurate reflections of reality. Many are distortions, exaggerations, or projections that have more to do with habit and mood than with what is actually happening. Most people do not distinguish between the thought and the reality. A thought appears, and it is treated as truth, not because it has been evaluated and confirmed, but because it arose internally, and internal experience is generally trusted as a reliable source of information. But thoughts are not always reliable. They are influenced by fatigue, by stress, by recent events, by physical condition, by unresolved emotions from earlier in the day or earlier in life. A thought that arises during a period of exhaustion may carry a bleakness that has nothing to do with the actual situation, and everything to do with the depleted state of the mind producing it. A thought that appears after a conflict may reflect the residual anger of the conflict, rather than an accurate assessment of the broader relationship. When thoughts are observed rather than immediately believed, a space opens up. A space in which the thought can be examined. Is this accurate? Is this helpful? Is this a reflection of what is actually happening, or is it a product of my current state? These questions do not need to be asked formally every time a thought arises. But the habit of holding thoughts lightly, of treating them as mental events rather than as established facts, changes the way the mind relates to its own output. The person who observes their thoughts is not at the mercy of every passing mental event. They can notice a thought without being swept away by it. They can feel the pull of a negative interpretation without following it to its worst conclusion. They can recognize when the mind is generating anxiety, self-criticism, or catastrophic predictions, and they can choose not to give those productions the authority they seem to demand. This is not suppression. The thoughts are not being pushed away. They are being noticed, acknowledged, and then evaluated rather than automatically accepted. And this evaluation, practiced regularly, gradually changes the internal landscape. The noise decreases, the clarity increases, and the person begins to experience a growing sense of agency over their own inner life that was not available when every thought was treated as gospel. Building awareness around internal reactions is closely connected to this capacity. Most people are unaware of the degree to which their internal reactions are patterned. They experience their reactions as fresh, spontaneous responses to new events, but in reality, many of their reactions are repetitions of established patterns. The same type of event triggers the same type of thought, which triggers the same type of emotion, which triggers the same type of behavior. And this sequence plays out so consistently that it becomes invisible. It feels like the only possible response, rather than one response among many. When awareness develops around these patterns, the person begins to notice the repetition. They begin to see that the reaction to a particular type of event is not a unique response to a unique situation, but a habitual pattern that has been running for years. The defensiveness that arises when competence is questioned, the withdrawal that happens when conflict appears, the self-criticism that follows any mistake, no matter how small. These are not fresh responses. They are rehearsed ones. And because they are rehearsed, they are also changeable. This does not mean changing them is easy. Patterns that have been reinforced over years are deeply established. They have momentum. They feel natural. They feel like the only option, but awareness is the first condition for change. Without it, the pattern runs unchallenged. With it, there is at least the possibility of a different response, a possibility that grows with each instance of noticing. And this possibility leads to another important shift in thinking, the choice of constructive interpretations over negative assumptions. Most people default to negative interpretations of ambiguous events. A colleague's short email is interpreted as hostility. A friend's delayed response is interpreted as disinterest. A manager's feedback is interpreted as dissatisfaction. In each case, the event is ambiguous. Multiple interpretations are possible, but the mind tends to select the negative one, not because the evidence supports it, but because the habit of interpreting ambiguity negatively is deeply established. Choosing a more constructive interpretation is not about being naive. It is not about ignoring genuine signals of difficulty. It is about recognizing that when the evidence is ambiguous, the interpretation that is chosen will determine the emotional experience that follows. And if the negative interpretation is no more supported by the evidence than the neutral or constructive one, then choosing the negative one is simply choosing to feel worse without justification. This is a subtle but important distinction. It is not about denying difficulty. It is about not manufacturing it. It is about reserving the emotional cost of a negative interpretation for situations in which the evidence genuinely supports it, and allowing ambiguous situations to remain ambiguous rather than filling them with invented negativity. When this habit develops, the amount of unnecessary emotional turmoil in daily life decreases noticeably. Events that previously would have triggered worry, defensiveness, or self-doubt pass through awareness with less impact, not because the person has stopped caring, but because they have stopped automatically assuming the worst when the evidence does not warrant it. Finding stability in changing circumstances is another expression of the kind of thinking that gradually improves life experience. Life is not static, conditions change. Relationships evolve, careers shift, health fluctuates, and the tendency, when circumstances change, is to lose balance, to feel as though the ground has shifted and the footing is no longer secure. But stability does not have to be tied to circumstances. It can be tied to something internal, to the way a person relates to change itself, to the recognition that change is normal, expected, and survivable, that previous changes were navigated, that the current change, however uncomfortable, is not qualitatively different from those that came before. When stability is rooted in this kind of internal understanding rather than in the specific arrangement of external conditions, the experience of change becomes less threatening. The conditions may shift, the job may change, the relationship may evolve, but the internal ground remains. The capacity for clear thinking, for emotional regulation, for patient evaluation. These are not dependent on the specific conditions of the moment. They travel with the person, and they provide a continuity that external circumstances can never guarantee. This is not about being unmoved by change. Some changes are genuinely difficult and deserve a full emotional response. But even in the midst of that response, there can be a part of the mind that recognizes the impermanence of the difficulty, that holds on to the understanding that this, too, will shift, that the current pain or confusion is a phase, not a permanent state. Recognizing patterns in thinking that create unnecessary pressure is another practical application of the kind of awareness being explored here. Many people carry thinking habits that generate internal pressure beyond what the situation actually demands. The habit of perfectionism, which turns every task into a test of worth. The habit of catastrophizing, which turns every setback into a potential disaster. The habit of mind reading, which assumes knowledge of what others are thinking without evidence. The habit of all or nothing thinking, which sees every outcome as either complete success or total failure. These patterns do not announce themselves. They operate quietly, shaping the emotional texture of daily experience without being recognized as optional. The person living under the pressure of perfectionism does not usually think of it as a thinking pattern. They think of it as a standard. The person catastrophizing does not experience it as a habit. They experience it as reasonable concern. And because these patterns feel like truth rather than interpretation, they are rarely questioned. But when they are questioned, when they are recognized as patterns rather than as accurate descriptions of reality, the pressure they generate begins to ease, not immediately, not completely, but perceptibly. The perfectionist begins to notice when the standard they are applying is unreasonable and offers themselves the space to produce something that is good enough rather than flawless. The catastrophizer begins to notice when the projected worst-case scenario is disproportionate to the actual risk and allows the projection to settle back towards something more realistic. These adjustments are small, they are internal, they are invisible to anyone else, but they change the daily experience of the person making them. They reduce the background level of stress that these patterns create. They free up mental energy that was being consumed by unnecessary pressure, and they create room for a more balanced, more proportionate engagement with the challenges of daily life, shifting focus toward long-term clarity rather than short-term emotion is perhaps one of the most consequential changes a person can make in how they think. Most daily decisions are influenced heavily by the emotion of the moment. The frustration of a bad morning, the excitement of a new possibility, the anxiety of an upcoming event, the disappointment of a recent result. These emotions are real, they are felt, and they exert a powerful influence on what a person decides to do next. But short-term emotion is a poor guide for long-term direction. The decision that feels right in the heat of anger is often wrong in the clarity of calm. The opportunity that looks irresistible in the glow of excitement often looks different when the glow fades. The retreat that feels necessary in the grip of fear often turns out to have been unnecessary when the fear subsides. Long-term clarity involves the ability to recognize when a current emotion is pulling behavior in a direction that does not serve the broader trajectory of life, and to resist that pull, not by suppressing the emotion, but by acknowledging it, feeling it, and then making the decision from a calmer, more considered place. This does not mean ignoring emotions. It means not giving them unilateral authority over decisions that have lasting consequences. This capacity is closely related to all the other capacities explored here. The pause between reaction and response, the observation of thoughts, the tolerance of discomfort, the awareness of patterns, they all contribute to the ability to step back from the emotional intensity of the moment and to make decisions that are aligned with long-term well-being rather than short-term relief. And this is where the cumulative effect of better thinking begins to become apparent. Each of these shifts, taken individually, is small. Each one addresses a specific aspect of how the mind engages with experience. But taken together, practiced consistently over time, they produce a qualitative change in how life is experienced. The background level of anxiety decreases. The reactivity that creates unnecessary conflict diminishes. The tendency to manufacture problems through projection and assumption weakens. The capacity to remain stable during difficulty strengthens. The ability to make clear, considered decisions improves. None of this happens dramatically. None of it happens all at once. It unfolds gradually through the daily practice of paying attention to how the mind is operating and making small adjustments when it is operating in ways that do not serve well-being. Understanding that better thinking leads to better decisions over time is a practical reality, not an abstract ideal. The person who pauses before reacting makes fewer decisions they regret. The person who observes their thoughts, rather than being controlled by them, avoids the cascading consequences of acting on distorted thinking. The person who distinguishes between what can be controlled and what cannot wastes less energy on futile mental activity and directs more toward productive action. The person who can tolerate discomfort without demanding immediate resolution makes choices that are more aligned with long-term benefit. Each better decision, however small, shifts the trajectory slightly, and over time, slightly shifted trajectories lead to significantly different destinations. not because any single decision was monumental, but because the direction was consistently better. And consistent direction, sustained over years, produces outcomes that feel, in retrospect, like they required a dramatic turning point. But they did not. They required a quiet, ongoing refinement of how the person thought about and responded to the events of their life. There is something else worth noticing about the way these shifts in thinking affect everyday experience. When the internal experience of life improves, the external experience often follows. Not because thinking alone changes circumstances, because better thinking leads to better behavior, and better behavior tends to produce better outcomes. The person who responds to conflict with calm rather than reactivity tends to have more stable relationships. The person who makes decisions from clarity rather than emotion tends to build a more coherent career. The person who does not waste energy on comparison and projection tends to have more energy available for the activities and pursuits that actually matter to them. The person who can sit with uncertainty without forcing premature conclusions tends to make choices that are better aligned with reality. These are not dramatic claims, they are observable patterns, and they suggest that the relationship between internal thinking and external outcomes is not incidental. It is causal, not in the simplistic sense that thinking good thoughts produces good results, but in the practical sense that clearer thinking leads to better behavior, and better behavior, sustained over time, tends to produce better outcomes. This does not mean that thinking alone is sufficient. External conditions matter. Resources matter. Opportunities matter. Health matters. Social support matters. All of these factors influence what is possible. But within whatever space is available, the quality of thinking determines how that space is used. Two people with identical resources and identical opportunities will use them very differently depending on how clearly they think, how effectively they manage their emotions, and how consistently they direct their attention toward what actually matters. And so the shift in thinking is not a replacement for action. It is a foundation for it. It is what ensures that the action taken is deliberate rather than reactive, considered rather than impulsive, aligned with long-term goals rather than driven by short-term feelings. And over time, the cumulative result of action taken from this kind of foundation is a life that feels more coherent, more intentional, more stable, not perfect, not free of difficulty, but navigated with greater clarity and greater calm. There is one more pattern worth exploring, and it involves the way a person relates to their own growth over time. Most people evaluate their progress by comparing their current position to their ideal. How far am I from where I want to be? And because the ideal is always ahead, always slightly out of reach, the answer to this question almost always produces a feeling of insufficiency. Not there yet, still falling short, still not enough. But there is another way to evaluate progress, and that is by comparing the current position to the starting point. How far have I come from where I was? This question produces a very different feeling, because when a person looks back over months or years of gradual change, the distance covered is often surprising. The patterns of thinking that once seemed unbreakable have loosened. The reactions that once felt automatic have become more measured. The clarity that once felt impossible has become more accessible. These changes do not announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, beneath the surface of daily experience. And they are easy to miss if the only measurement being used is the distance to the ideal. But when the measurement includes the distance from the starting point, the progress becomes visible, and that visibility provides something that is often lacking during periods of gradual change. A sense that the effort is working, that the shifts are real, that the quality of daily experience has in fact improved, even if the improvement has been so gradual that it went unnoticed. Life does not always change immediately. Circumstances have their own timeline. Conditions shift according to forces that are not always within individual control, and the desire for immediate, visible improvement is understandable, but often unmet by the pace of external reality. But the way life is experienced can change much sooner. It can begin to change the moment thinking becomes more intentional, the moment the pause between event and reaction is introduced, the moment the habitual interpretation is questioned, the moment the comparison with others is allowed to pass without acceptance, the moment the mind's projection about the future is recognized as a projection rather than a prophecy. Individuals who begin to think more clearly and more deliberately often notice subtle differences. Before any external condition has changed, they feel less reactive. They notice that situations which previously would have triggered a strong emotional response now produce a milder, more manageable one. They find that they are less easily pulled into other people's emotional states. They notice that decisions feel less urgent, less pressured, less driven by the anxiety of the moment. They think more clearly. They notice that the constant background noise of worry and projection has decreased, not to zero, but enough to create room for calmer, more focused thought. They find that they are better able to evaluate situations on their merits, rather than through the lens of fear or frustration. They notice that their capacity to hold complexity, to consider multiple perspectives, to tolerate ambiguity, has grown quietly stronger. They handle challenges with more stability. They notice that setbacks, while still uncomfortable, no longer feel catastrophic. That unexpected changes, while still disorienting, no longer trigger the same level of panic. That difficult conversations, while still unpleasant, no longer feel like existential threats. The challenges are the same, but the internal experience of facing them has shifted. These differences are subtle. They are not dramatic. They do not make for a compelling before and after narrative, but they are real, and they are felt, and over time, as they accumulate, they change the overall quality of daily life in ways that are both genuine and lasting. Most people wait for life to improve before they feel better. They wait for circumstances to shift, for problems to resolve, for conditions to align. They place the improvement of their internal experience on the other side of an external change that may or may not come. And so they wait. And while they wait, the thinking patterns that shape their experience continue to operate unchallenged, producing the same emotional responses to whatever comes along. But often, the shift begins in the opposite direction. It does not start with better circumstances. It starts with better thinking, with the small, quiet decision to pay attention to how the mind is interpreting what is happening, to notice the patterns, to question the assumptions, to pause before reacting, to hold thoughts lightly, to direct attention toward what is within control, to tolerate discomfort without demanding immediate resolution, to choose clarity over impulse, to respond rather than react. When thinking becomes clearer and more intentional, the experience of life begins to improve. Not because life has become easier, not because the difficulties have disappeared, but because the mind engaging with those difficulties has become more capable, more stable, more deliberate. The filter has changed. And when the filter changes, everything that passes through it looks different. Over time, that quiet change becomes significant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent, because it was maintained, because the person kept paying attention, kept adjusting, kept choosing the clearer thought over the habitual one. And in that sustained, unglamorous effort, something real was built, a way of thinking that supports a better experience of being alive. Not a perfect experience, but a better one, a more stable one, a more honest one, a more grounded one. And that, ultimately, is what becomes possible when thinking changes. Not a different life, but a different experience of the same life. An experience that is shaped less by the automatic and more by the intentional. Less by the reactive and more by the considered. Less by the habitual and more by the aware. That shift is available, not someday, not after conditions improve, but now, in the next thought, in the next reaction, in the next moment when the mind reaches for its familiar pattern, and the person, quietly, gently, chooses something different. That is where it begins. And over time, that is where everything changes.